Oh, there we go. I am on. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm going to wait a minute here until I can let some people jump on. Not that I ever actually figured out last time how to see who is jumping on, but I'm just going to wait a minute anyway. So I am down at Canon doing the webinar down here this time all by myself. So I'm still socially isolating. But hopefully the internet will be better here and you won't hear my dog barking. So I'm just going to let's see. Okay. See if it'll show me down here if people are hopping on. All right. So can everyone hear me okay? Someone could leave a comment and let me know. That would be great. Perfect there. Okay, thank you. I still cannot, I will figure out before next time where it shows me what people are jumping on. And hi, hello, okay, good. You can hear me, great. All right, perfect. So week 2 of writing webinar. Today I'm talking about plots and also about world building. So I'm gonna start with plot and spend more time on that. And then I'll do the same thing I did last time and just leave room for questions at the end, hopefully. I didn't really talk through this one ahead of time to see how long it takes, but I'll talk kind of quickly. So the thing that oh great, yes, people are here. Perfect. The thing I find so interesting, just almost navigated out about plot is, and another author whose webinar I attended back in the day pointed this out, and I thought it was really accurate, is that plot is so incredibly changeable, much more so than I think a lot of other aspects of your book, more so than that initial feeling you get of mood or setting or premise. A lot of those things will stay pretty much the same throughout the course of writing your novel. But the plot, with all of my books, I've done just drastic plot changes. I've moved scenes around, cut scenes completely, added entirely new scenes. I think it's pretty amazing how much you can wrestle with the plot and still have it be the same book, because that sameness lies somewhere else in the story. So just to start with the basics, every story has a plot, and readers or listeners or watchers of stories come into them with certain expectations, right? And these are expectations that you want to fulfill as a story writer. So take The Hobbit. It starts with the main character Bilbo in his normal life. He's thrown into an adventure and sets off on a quest. And when he gets to the Lonely Mountain, he and the dwarves find that Smaug is gone, and they get their treasure back and live happily ever after. Like, that would be the most unsatisfying story, right? Because it fizzles, even though because the main character gets what they want. We expect our stories to build and build and build to some big exciting moment, so that the end of the story feels like a sigh of relief. If your story doesn't do that, if you picture it, like a line, and the line is mostly flat, Or maybe there's like one high point right at the beginning and then it just fizzles out. That's going to be a really unsatisfying story. So the basic plot has a beginning, a middle, and an end, which sounds super simplistic, but you would be surprised at how hard it is for people to follow this pattern. Usually what happens is it's fairly easy to start a story, right? But then you get stuck in the middle and you're kind of like a pig in a blanket rooting around for the ending. So we're going to talk a little bit about ways to avoid getting stuck in what's often called the muddy middle. If you're like me and you've read any number of writing books, you'll know that the actual structure of books is highly debated. There are books that say if you follow this exact structure, and then they have like 10 points, then you will have a successful story. But I really don't think it's that simple. I think things can get pretty wooden if you try to just plug it into a matrix like that. And so, you have to do at the end of the day, you have to tell the story in the best way possible. But there are still guidelines that I think are just across the board recommendable. So I'm going to offer first a quick look into the different types of plots, and then talk about the basic skeleton of a story and the guidelines there that I think are helpful to follow, and you can see what works for you. So types of plot. If you've read the book, The 7 Basic Plots by Christopher Booker, he suggests that there are only 7 plots in the history of storytelling. He calls them rags to riches, overcoming the monster, the quest, voyage and return, comedy, tragedy, and rebirth. I'm pretty sure I've read other books that say similar things, but maybe have a different number of stories. I know I read a book in filmmaking class that had different categories, but a similar idea. It doesn't really matter how you categorize them. The idea behind this, the underlying principle, is that we recycle stories. If you start a story with, once upon a time, there was a lonely farm boy who dreamed of adventure in the great beyond, and one day an old acquaintance showed up and said there was a maiden in trouble on the other side of the mountains. We know what's going to happen, right? This, like I mentioned last week, is called the promise of the premise. We love to have these moments set up for us. A woman arrives at a castle and the owner says, "Don't go in the West Wing," so we know what's going to happen. If this is your first or second or third novel that you're working on, you should not be trying to reinvent the wheel. So you should not be trying to come up with a new story structure. It is perfectly okay, and in fact recommendable, that you find one of these old stories. Maybe it is a Bible story, Samson and Delilah, or it's a fairy tale, it's Pinocchio, or it's Cupid and Psyche, a myth. You drape your characters and your world along that story structure and see what happens. And different genres will have different plot structures, depending on whether you're writing an epic fantasy or a murder mystery or a romance. There are certain expectations built into those genres that you want to meet, which means you'll need to know them, which means you need to write a lot and read a lot. There we go. So when you're talking about a story, it has 2 layers. It has the bones, which will be similar to a lot of other stories. And then it's going to have, I guess you could say, the skin, the clothing, the thing that makes your story different. So plot basics. Plot, at its core, is about character, because it's answering the question, what does your character want? How are they going to get it? And what is standing in their way? Another way to say that is your main character should drive the plot. So this is an important distinction here, something to talk about, like in terms of active versus passive characters. If the plot is acting on them, so things are happening and all that your main character is doing is just reacting to it, it's not going to be as interesting of a story, and it doesn't lend itself to as achievable of a goal. You want your main character's goal to be as active as possible. Find the gem, defeat the bad guy, save the family, get the girl, that sort of thing. Because then it's easy to identify the moment that your character wins. He got the girl, the curtains go down, the dragon was killed, hooray, end of story. So when you're stuck plotting, if you're stuck when you're thinking through your plot, one thing to do is think about, like I said, what does my main character want? And what's an active step that they could take towards that goal? Now, you get bonus points if that active step actually messes things up more for them. Like if it pushes the ball, kicks the ball further down the field, like the goal, so they're not able to actually get the thing that they wanted. However, there are plenty of stories where the main character does start out passive. They're unwilling, they don't want to go. Like that is fine. Think of Luke Skywalker. He doesn't want to get thrown into this plot. He has all these reasons, but eventually the circumstances around him change and sort of force him to go on the journey. He still makes the choice, but before that he was much more passive. Like I don't want to do this. So some of the most interesting plot or tensions happen because the main character does things, acts in a certain way, and actually makes their own situation worse. So in The Winter King, this isn't too spoilery, but when Cora enlists a friend to help her in her quest to find the king's book, when he gets captured, her guilt is way higher because she did that. It was her fault. She thought she was getting closer to her goal. She actually muddied the waters way more. She's now further away from her goal. So you start out, you've got your very active main character, and we're keeping in mind that the plot is going to be about them and what they want, right? So we'll start with Act 1. I'm going to divide it into acts because that's just how I think of it when I'm working on a story. But you can do this different ways. Act 1, you could call it the beginning. It starts out with the status quo. This is the beginning of the story where you show us the normal life of your character. And normal does not mean and should not mean boring. You really want to avoid starting your story with your character waking up, looking in a mirror, brushing their teeth, going to school. Like when we say that that something should be like normal life, it should still be an interesting part of their normal life. So someone's not like on page 3 and they're like, okay, I've just walked through a checklist of somebody's daily, morning routine. In my current work in progress, my main character starts the story in the middle of a heist, but this is actually normal for her. That's a thing she does most of the time, but it's still an exciting place to start the story. Another thing you're going to want to do at the beginning of your story is reveal to your readers some conflicts that your character is struggling with. And those should be external conflicts, maybe other people, friendships, or a hardship in their life. And then internal conflicts, which would be like a weakness or an insecurity. So you set those up in this first act. Like these are the hurdles that my main character needs to overcome in order to be happier in life. So if we use The Winter King again, we see Cora in her natural element at the beginning of the story. She's helping her mother get ready for a feast. She interacts with her best friend Peter, with her mom, her siblings. We meet Nils, and we already know he's going to be trouble. We know that Cora is harboring a secret bitterness towards the Winter King that's damaging her relationships with other people. So that's internal, right? She's got a bitterness issue. We know that she's got a bad relationship with her former friend, Abalone, and that her family is on the brink of starvation. So those are external issues. So you've set this stuff up, and what you should do is, if you're writing this out on paper, if you draft on paper, or if you have a big whiteboard and you're sort of graphing the plot of your book, that mark that you've set these things up at the beginning, and then mark at the end how you're going to resolve these things. So hopefully with someone like Cora, she goes from bitterness to thankfulness, right? That would hopefully be the arc of my story. And that way you'll be able to see what you're working towards. And with characters, again, we'll talk about this more later, but you need to resolve both the external issues you've set up and the internal issues. So she's dealing with major poverty that needs to be resolved. I think this is actually a good place for me to pause and talk about subplots, because I had a question in my Instagram stories about subplots. Some people draw a distinction between plot layers, which is like layers of the story that are all happening to the main character, and subplots, which is like things happening to secondary characters or like a secondary character's plot line. I think that's kind of a fussy distinction, because unless you're writing some Dickensian sprawl, I think all of your subplots should tie back into the main plot. Or, I mean, if you're writing adult fiction, this is more likely to happen too, I think. But particularly for middle grade and young adults, you're going to want to keep your subplots directly relating to your main plot. So in The Winter King, Matthias's interest in Greta is technically a subplot, but it's a subplot that Cora uses to further her goal. Regardless of what you call them, subplots should always reference back to and influence the journey of the main character. The main character is your main point of interest, and so you definitely don't want your subplots to overwhelm that or be more interesting. What they're helpful for, though, is giving your story depth and interest. If you want to show a certain aspect of your character's personality, subplots are a really great way to do that. So again, with The Winter King, without the character of Abelone, the story could still exist. She is a subplot, but I put her in for several reasons. One is that teen readers can relate to this type of friendship struggle, right? Friends drift apart, there's tensions, and it shows off several parts of Cora's personality. It explains some of the hurt and the bitterness that she's feeling. It gives a concrete example of how she's being shunned. Instead of me just saying the villagers shunned Cora and her family, I can just show it through this relationship. But it's definitely something that needs to be resolved. And I wanted her as a subplot to be so integral to the story that it didn't feel like you could take it out easily. So if you've read the book, by the end, she really does pull her own weight in the story. Incidentally, someone asked in the last webinar about how to make your story longer, and subplots is where you want to do that, or you can do that. I was helping someone brainstorm their story recently that needed to be longer, and the main character, another problem with the story that we were working on was that the main character needed to be a little more sympathetic. So I suggested adding in a character, a neighborhood kid who's a bully, and that way we can see the main character stand up to that bully, which makes us like the main character. And it lengthens out the story and it adds some interest. But you do need to make sure that you're weaving that bully into the full plot of the story so it doesn't feel like they were just added for cushioning, or you put them in and then forgot about them. So if this is a story about a boy, who finds treasure in an empty lot or something, the bully needs to either also be going for it or getting in their way all the time, or be somehow related to the person who buried the treasure, or, there's a lot of ways to do it, but I'd pick one that's most satisfying for your story. So, okay, that's enough of a tangent about subplots, but I'd really recommend that you weave the subplots in near the beginning, because it would have been super weird if Gollum showed up in the last 3 chapters, of Lord of the Rings. So the end of Act 1 is what's known as the inciting incident, which you will hear many times throughout the course of your writing life. It's the moment when something happens that changes the main character's life permanently. So there is no going back to normal after that. A group of dwarves and a wizard show up at your house with a map and a story. Your aunt and uncle die, and some strange desert wizard convinces you to join him on an adventure to save a princess. The village feast is ruined, and your mother is demoted. Whatever this thing is, it needs to be personal to the main character, and it needs to force them to make a decision. This decision, by the way, is important here because it needs to have really high stakes. So I feel like I jump up and down on stakes a lot, but that's because there are times when I have read stories or drafts of stories, or I have written drafts of stories where I've thought the main character could just walk away from this right now and it would be fine. Like, we could resolve this whole story by them just being like, I'm not going to do this anymore and leave. And if that's what your stakes are, if that's as invested as the character is, then that's just too flimsy. So it needs to be a decision that they make that they can't walk away from, a choice that they have to see through to the bitter end. So you've thrown your character into motion now. We're out of Act 1. We've jumped into Act 2. The middle should feel like a gradual rise that's leading towards the climax of the story. So Act 2 is when the stakes are getting raised. The character is making choices that they think are going to lead them to their goal, but are hopefully tangling things up further. You can really lean in on the subplots, the secondary characters during this time. Whether that's romance or friendship troubles or whatever. So this is the part where you're putting gradual but increasing pressure on your main character. One way you can avoid having your middle feel like the muddy middle is by having a distinct halfway point around, like at the middle of Act 2, where there's some sort of a big shift, either in the character's psyche, like they have a moment of self-revelation, or they discover something that changes the way they're tackling their main goal, something that's a surprise. And I guess you could call it like a change in polarity. Things went from mostly positive to mostly negative, or mostly negative to mostly positive, but it's like a false positive, right? Because we're still going to lead our character to the edge of this cliff. In The Winter King, this happens when Cora discovers the Winter King's book. So then at the end of Act 2, you're going to have a second turn, a point where things have gotten so bad that the character has to make another choice that's going to fling them into the climax, into the final battle, into whatever it is. In film, this is referred to as the dark night of the soul. Things have gotten so bad or hard for your character that they have to make a choice they didn't want to make. Again, non-spoilery, in The Winter King, this is when Cora decides she's going into the Winter King's temple. This is the choice that will propel your book into Act 3, the climax, the final conflict, the big showdown, whatever it is that your main character has to do to achieve their goal. And after that moment, we get this nice, gentle denouement where you let the reader exhale and you show them the new normal. So it should not feel the same as where they were at the beginning of the book. But it's going to feel more normal. Like you can envision the character going on and leading a normal life in this new world with hopefully a better personality, having overcome whatever weaknesses they were struggling with. So these are really broad brushstrokes. And I think most everyone agrees on these, and they're going to stay fairly the same no matter what genre you're dealing with. And as far as how much you want to have fleshed out before you get started writing, I think that is up to you. I have written books where I've basically known nothing except the ending, like The Winter King. But I will say that with The Winter King, I had to do probably 30 drafts, maybe 40. I lost count at some point. And basically that first draft is my outline, and that I then have to finagle and just really tear it apart. I've written other novels where I've deliberately outlined each chapter. And the temptation there is it can get a little too rigid and wooden. I think it's healthy and advisable to know your beginning, your inciting incident, the thing in the middle that's going to change things up for your main character, and the conclusion. I think that that's a good enough springboard because from there, when you are faced with a choice, you can look at your end goal and see, okay, when I'm making this choice, which one will get us closer to the goal I'm working towards. And when you're thinking through your plot, I think it's always helpful to ask certain questions like, how could I make the central problem worse or harder on the main character? Related to this is the idea of how do I raise the tension? Although, and this is important, tension can be positive or negative. A love interest blossoming is positive tension. Going into Narnia is positive tension. Getting off the train at Hogwarts. Those types of things add interest and intrigue and excitement, and they're not negative, they're not bad things. So this isn't all about making things bad and hard, although I say that and yet I wrote The Winter King, which is a lot of bad and hard, but it's more making things interesting for your readers. And of course, you're wanting to always keep in the back of your mind, how can I raise the stakes? What complications can I throw in that would deepen the conflict? How can I add layers to my main character or to the story to make it richer and deeper? Okay, so that's, let's see what I'm at, 25 minutes. That was my spiel on plot. I'm going to touch on world building now, because it's one of my absolute favorite parts. I love world building. So much so that I've had critique partners be like, clearly you love your world. Could you also love the plot a little more because you're spending a whole lot of time describing things? And so world building is tied up in mood. And I cannot stress how important mood is in a story. And I think that it is sometimes something that people do not utilize the richness and depth that their world can lend to their story. So when you think back on a memory, so often our memories are just like an assortment of feelings, right? The sun on your face, the smell of the kitchen, the sound of the waves. These are visceral sensations. And they're sticky and they're lasting. They stick in your memory. And if you want your story to stick and last in people's memories, then you need to give them that feeling. So you need to give them the feeling that they are in this world. And so that means that you need to know what this world feels like and tastes like and smells like. The Winter King has a very specific mood. It's the bone-deep ache of winter waiting, the beauty and the danger of a Nordic world where the old ways haven't fully died. It's the feel of cold seeping through the toes of your boots or the bite of a wind gust on the back of your neck. It's a bit of incense and smoke and superstition, a lot of cold weather, and hopefully a feeling like this might have been a myth. Mood and the world of your story are, again, tied to your main character and what would best serve them. This will often be tied up in your main character's emotional weakness or in their external conflict. So you'll want to make deliberate choices at the beginning. First of all, how big is the world of your novel? So for the Disney movie Tangled, or any Rapunzel type story, you start very small, right? And then you expand and show a lot more of the world. In The Winter King, because the story is about a village trapped in winter, I wanted my setting to feel claustrophobic, which is why I set it somewhere bordered by frozen fjords and impassable mountains. So Cora cannot get help from anywhere else. She has nowhere to go. It's a pretty small, limited world intentionally. Also, related to this, what is the climate of your world? And how does that influence your characters and the plot? I mean, if you envision the Winter King set in like, I don't know, the desert or like Palm Springs, I don't know. It just doesn't work. It needed to be in that specific setting, and you want your story to feel like it needed to be in this place. In the Winter King, we move from fall to winter, and then the ending, the exhale, takes place in spring. For the story that I'm working on set in an alternate Venice, I really focused on things being watery and green, and also the creepiness of like rotting vegetation and plant death that comes along with a watery setting, because this story has monsters in it. So what is the time period? That's another question that you will want to answer. Even if it's fantasy, is it going to have medieval vibes, futuristic vibes, steampunk vibes? So you want to be intentional with your setting. And once you've decided on it, you need to add in very visceral descriptions so that we feel like we're there. So that when we're thinking back on your book, we have what almost feels like a memory of that place. So the ways you can layer in mood are, you can have the main character be feeling things, right? This is on a really basic level. They need to feel it, though, with all 5 senses. So it's very easy to describe to the eyes. She saw a river bathed in golden sunlight. That's easy to do. It's actually really hard for us to relate to that, to have it be particularly sticky. If you go deeper than that, though, and you describe the smell of the air near a river, or the feel of like soggy moss beneath her shoes by the riverbank, that gives us a much stronger sensation, right? So the more you can do with working with other senses besides just sight. Another thing to look at is to populate your world with animals and objects that are concrete and real. And don't worry too much if you can't do this in the first draft. If you want to just say a dog ran across her path, or something like that, like keeping it generic in the first draft just while you're busy trying to get this story out, that's fine. Just make sure that when you go back and do your editing that you think to yourself, how can I describe a dog so it's not just a dog? What types of dogs are native to this part of the world? Or what does it look like? Or could it be a 3-legged dog, to make it more interesting? Don't just say your character ate a quick lunch. Describe what the lunch is. I did a lot of research on what birds and beasts live in Norway and Sweden and Iceland, because I was setting my story kind of roughly in that part of the world, or a fantasy world that mimics that. Research the types of plants that are in the part of the world that you've set up, and have your character run their fingers over those plants and then describe that feeling. And lastly, use your similes to great effect in world building. Similes and metaphors. I'm a big fan of both simile and metaphor. I use them a lot in The Winter King because they are such a helpful way to give mood to a story. But I'm pretty picky about what I use to describe them. I spend a lot of time just like staring off into space trying to think of the right simile, because I want it to evoke a certain feeling. Wonder or horror or humor. And you can really give somebody like an off-putting feel if you get the simile wrong. And also it needs to be something that the main character whose head you're inside of would know. So like I think at one point in The Winter King, I described someone's voice flying towards Cora like a dark crow. And I chose that and not like an arrow, which is still like a bullet would be totally off, right? An arrow makes more sense because of the time period she's living in, but Grimsby is a relatively pacifistic society, and so Cora doesn't really deal with bows and arrows. So I stuck with a simile that she would know to help enhance the mood of the story. So another thing to keep in mind with world building is that when you give your readers a strange concept or word or magic system, it's sort of like a withdrawal from the bank of their trust. And we have all done this, I think. You pick up a book and you're looking at it and you're like, there are so many names that start with X and Z and have like the last letter capitalized. This happens a lot in science fiction, but it also happens in fantasy, where you just are like, I cannot hold all these things in my mind. So you just want to be really careful with how fantastical you want to be. And you can get away with a lot, but you have to be careful for one reason, because you want to avoid straight up exposition, right? You can't introduce a character and call them a ranger and then have like a footnote where someone is like, where it says a ranger is someone who blah, blah, blah. You have to reveal it naturally through the story. So think of it kind of like giving your reader apples. They start reading the story. You introduce something they don't know, an outlandish name, that's an apple. A secret code, that's another apple. A particular aspect of your world that they need to remember and file away. So if you give them 10 apples in the first chapter of the book, they're going to start dropping them. And eventually it's like they'll give up and go somewhere else. So be careful with how you introduce these foreign concepts. Just don't overload, especially in the first chapter. So a question I got on Instagram stories that was really good was, how do you decide how deep you go with world building? She said, if there's a continuum of building between Tolkien and his entire mythologies and language versus Lewis throwing in beavers with sewing machines. If you wanted to feel realistic, but you don't want to go as far as Tolkien, what are some things to pay attention to? So as a specific example, she said, in a mythical land, animal land, can my favorite trees and plants coexist even though in our world they grow in different regions? Not like wildly disparate, but somewhat. This is, it's a little bit difficult to answer because it will be different for every story. The most basic level, I would say, and this is not the most helpful answer, but it is, you need to do as much world building as your story needs. And what your story needs, first and foremost, is clarity, which means if you have set up a system of guilds and thieves and guards and mayors and aristocracy, etc., then you need to know how it all works, which means you probably need some spreadsheets detailing like balances of power and who does what in your city. And if something is vague in your mind, then it will be vague for the reader as well. After that, you should have done enough world building that the story is consistent. And that's going back to the beavers with sewing machines, because that was such a funny little glitch in Lewis's normally pretty tight, I guess, world building that everyone still like puzzles over and explains in different ways. But I don't know. I'm fine with it because it's Lewis. He could do what he wants. But I think that you should keep in mind the laws that govern your world and have a folder saved with that information for referencing. So it needs to be internally consistent, and it needs to make sense to our minds. You can't just say, well, this is medieval England, but there are also cell phones, because having cell phones implies a whole lot of technological progress that medieval England simply didn't have. So it needs to be logically consistent. In general, I think it's really helpful to have done a lot of research for believability purposes, but you don't necessarily need to do it up front. There have been times in my stories where I'll be writing and I'll get to a scene set in like a stable and realize how very little I know about Scandinavian stables in the 1100s. And so I might pause then and do some quick research, or I might just give myself a little footnote and have, that on the side and say research stables. If you're doing high fantasy, so something set in a completely other place, you will need to be making a lot more decisions up front. You'll need to have in mind the basics of your world, like government, trade and commerce, food supply lines, currency, natural resources available, because those are things that will most likely influence your main character. What is not going to influence your main character necessarily would be like a deep dive into the founding of the city or the origin story for the city's religion. Now, it might be, depending on the type of story you're telling. So again, that goes back to what does your story need? But if you just find yourself off in a corner inventing a new language and you realize it's because you are putting off actually writing the story, then step away from your research and start writing your story. And another thing to remember too is that you can always go back and change things, or add things, or layer in this world. As far as consistency within the world, if you're in fantasy, you can get away with small changes, I think. Although I did, funnily enough, have someone write a review of The Winter King in which they pointed out some food that they would not have had in this climate. Which, so you might still get that, which is fine. In The Winter King, I intentionally set it somewhere where the ocean freezes, which is pretty far north. But then I also included some plants and animals that don't live that far north. And even when I added in some foods, in my mind, I was like, well, they have southern merchants that do trading. So that was my explanation. But you don't want it to be something where a reader really does stop and be like, wait, what? How did they get there? I wouldn't do anything crazy drastic that defies like major laws of ecosystems, because it will stick out to the reader. And my last note on world building is that I found with the Venice story, that sometimes when I was stuck in plot, I would go back and do more research, and the solution would come through the research because your characters are a product of the world they inhabit. And so I remember reading about some particular custom during Carnival in Venice and thinking, oh, that's when my main character would have the opportunity to do this. So it can sometimes be a cure for a plot problem if you're stuck. Those are my notes on world building. If you want homework for the week, since we're at home, what else are you going to do? You could go online and Google the 7 basic plot structures and read about them. Spend some time trying to figure out which structure you're imitating, and find an old book or movie that's similar to your plot and read it actively, looking for when things happen, when the story climbs and dips, etc. Start thinking about the setting of your novel. And for an exercise, envision setting it somewhere else. If it's in a desert, try a rainforest and just see what happens. And so next week, we're going to talk about characters and dialogue. And I just wanted to really quickly plug, I forgot to bring it with me, but the book that I was holding in my photo on the last photo on my Facebook page is John Truby's The Anatomy of Story, which I highly recommend. It is, it reads at times like a textbook. It's a little dense, I guess you could say, but it was one of the clearest and most concise books on writing that tackled in alternating chapters plots and characters and how to integrate them into your story. There were parts I disagreed with, and I do think that it's written for adults. And he's specifically, I think, talking about film. And so there are times when he references, movies that are not awesome. So parents, I wouldn't necessarily go buy it and throw it at your teen without looking through it first. But it is just, it's really smart and concise. And I read a lot of plot and character books, and I appreciated that he approached both of them. So the very last week, we'll do characters and dialogue next week. And then the very last week, I want to talk specifically about first chapters because they are so important, the impression that you give, and also about edits and revisions and critique groups. And I'm hoping to be able to offer feedback on some first chapters. If anyone has any they want to send to me after that last webinar, using the tools you've learned over the month. I will probably have to charge a small flat fee for that aspect. But just if you're thinking about that when you're working on writing and considering whether you want to send something my way, I do a lot of editing, and I have been edited a lot by people, so I like it, and I know pretty well what I'm doing. If anyone has any questions, I'm looking at my, oh, it scrolls down. Okay. Oh, hi, Poppy. I'm glad you finished my book. That's great. That is what quarantine time is all about, is reading. Incidentally, if you wanted to order my book, it is currently out of stock on Amazon because they sold out, which is great, but then they're not restocking at the moment because it's non-essential. But you can order it through canonpress.com and get a signed copy that way. Let's see. Okay, does The Winter King, would you say, have romance? Yes, it does. It is sweet and, it is intentionally not the main plot of the story, because one thing that bugs me to no end when I read young adult literature is that you have these characters in really, like horrible situations, or like they're trying to save the world, but most of the story is spent them trying to figure out who they like, and that just, I find that not believable, and also just a little tired and overdone. So I actually, well, obviously I like it since I wrote it, but I like the romance in it because I think it is believable, and also it's an important growth part of Cora's character. How many books have you written? Okay, well, I've written 5. Like, I have written from start to finish 5. 3 of them I'm throwing out. I really need to figure out how to actually destroy them so that nobody, after my death, finds them on a flash drive and is like, oh, I bet she would like these to be published. And to my horror, well, I guess I won't. I'll be in heaven, so I won't care. But I don't want that to happen. I have written another one that's complete, that's also young adults. It's the Venice one I've referenced several times. I need to go back and look through it again and see what any polishing done before I submit it to any editor. But and then I'm halfway through another, and then I have The Winter King, and then I'm halfway through another one, which the next question, how much can you tell us about your next book? Not very much, mainly because, well, I can tell you the pitch, which currently is in an 18th century alternate New York. A 12-year-old thief named Lyra, depending on how you pronounce it, is attempting to take over as the greatest thief in her guild, but the person she has to beat out is her father. That is the short and sweet pitch. It's a heist story. It's been super fun. I'm enjoying writing middle grade, and it's just been great. Again, because I love world building so much, getting to write a steampunk 18th century New York has just thrilled me to no end. So, oh, I'm so glad, Jen, that you liked the way I wrote The Romance in the Winter King. And to be honest, that was really hard. I spent a lot of time. So when I'm doing edits on like a thread through a story, I'll write out like chapter by chapter, Peter and Cora's romance, chapter 1, what happens, chapter 2, chapter 3, to sort of see like the evolution of it. And and it was a really tricky part. I felt like I worked hard on it, so I'm glad that people are enjoying that. All right. Hey, I'm right about on time. I was hoping to hit under an hour. Good. I hope more people will read it. That's, of course, always the goal. Let's see. What if your book is not the style of the age, like romance with 12-year-olds? Yeah. So if you're writing a middle grade story, just steer clear of it. For a couple of reasons. One of which is I just don't think it's helpful or necessarily healthy to have 12-year-olds thinking about romance for their age group, you know. Again, like it's one thing to be 12 and to read The Winter King, which has Cora is marriageable age. Like that's the age when people are getting married in her village. So like it makes sense for her to be thinking about romance. But yeah, one of the things that I think is super fun about middle grade and that I'm enjoying a lot is that you can have characters interacting, boys and girls, without having to go into romance. So, any other questions? I'll give it a few more seconds here and see, but that might be it. All right. Well, thank you so much, guys, for listening in again. And if you have any more questions, leave them in the feed. If you want to, you can also ask about next week. I'll be doing, like I said, characters and dialogue. So if you have any specific questions about that, let me know either here or on my Instagram account, which is also, I think, Christine Cohen author. So I will see you next week.